Hey everybody, this is Leon, and this video is going to be the most important video ever made in history about XR fragments. I will try really hard. Okay, so what I want to talk about is the fact that this demo environment, which is also on the website, I'm showing it in all my videos. This is not XR fragments. This is just an example viewer, just an example XR hypermedia viewer, which supports the XR fragments specification. So I also want to emphasize the importance and opportunities for client-side URL specifications like XR fragments. With client-side, I mean everything after the hash is basically an instruction for the file format viewer, which is in this case a GLTF, but could also be an FBX or any 3D file. So yeah, XR fragments and this client-side URL spec is basically protocol agnostic. It just happens to be HTTPS, but it can also be IPFS, whatever. It's file agnostic, so GLTF is just a file here. It could be anything, any 3D file which has a timeline would be supported. So having that said, let me sort of like zoom out a bit to the potential of client-side URL specifications, which you yourself can also make. You are awesome. This demo environment is made in A-frame, but A-frame is just a VR framework, which is built on top of Three.js, which is just a 3D scene graph, which runs in a web browser, which is just a WebXR environment. This web browser is also just an app, which runs on NixOS, which is just an operating system. So XR fragments, or any client-side URL spec, could actually run on an operating system level. The potential of the web is not necessarily made possible by the web browser per se. No, any app or operating system can become a browser itself. I would like to think in terms of recursive hypermedia browsers. Any app doesn't have to be a web browser, or any operating system could, by default, treat URLs as first-class citizens. Imagine an operating system which has a sort of protocol store and a file format viewer store, and you can basically sort of like cherry pick which protocols and file formats you want the operating system to support. That would allow the operating system, but this could also be done on an app level, by the way, to have these stores, but this would allow the viewer to consume URLs and also consume the client-side specs or hints at the same time. Imagine how little coding that would require. Instead of coding all kind of custom apps, or custom VR experiences, or other apps, games, imagine if you could use all that time and spend that time on the assets themselves, the 3D file, for example, in this case, index.gltf, or a certain game format. Imagine if you could focus all your time on the assets and you could sort of low code the experience by just passing some client-side hints. For example, XR fragments in case of 3D documents. This would disrupt things in a similar way, just like the web browser did or basically hypertext did in the old days. In the old days, everybody was coding like crazy custom apps, just like people are coding custom games these days. The moment hypertext came around, the whole idea became, hey, how about we just sort of put links into the assets, into the text documents, HTML basically, and then we only need one viewer. So I can really see a future where more client-side URL specs could sort of, allow a stack of fragments which can be used together and could just instruct the operating system or app to project the file format viewer in a certain way. Another takeaway from this is also that it's a mistake to think that specs and standards must come from big corporations and organizations. I think it's better to think of them as promoters of certain specs and ideas. It is very rare that big organizations and big corporations come up with specs from scratch. There is a common ground called the open source community, where people come up with crazy ideas of future use cases which large corporations and organizations have no time to look into. So usually they sort of piggyback on the open source innovation. An example is the Linux KDE community, which created WebKit, which was later adopted and tweaked by Apple. So it's a mistake to think that you cannot come up with specs or standards. It's a mistake. Actually, if you just keep in mind that if you just focus on the direction of the spec and not the spec itself, then you can do a lot of good. So there is no stealing. A spec is sort of, it's an idea, it's a direction. So if somebody else or a big company sort of copies ideas from your spec, then that is mission succeeded. That is like the most epic thing to happen ever. Don't think of it of stealing, because specs are supposed to sort of liberate people, to liberate, in my opinion, people from coding. I think we code way too much. If I think of XR fragments, also one of the ideas is that I think too much time is spent on coding custom viewers. Just like coding a game, it requires a lot of custom stuff. And any small spec, just like XR fragments, which makes it easier to just focus on the content and just have the URL to control certain features of file formats, then I think that is a big win. And I think that if you know some cool file formats, doesn't have to be 3D, with some cool features, then I think you should try to come up with a spec as soon as you feel like you're coding certain features over and over again. This is how specs should be created, I think. And I hope this helps. I hope I can put out the message there that normal people can create specs, and that is the direction and the spirit, the soul of the spec, which should be the end goal. And if somebody is inspired by that, that is mission completed. it's not, it shouldn't be sort of a, you shouldn't be laser focused on that your spec will become the spec. No. Anyways, I hope this helps, and see you in the next video. Cheers.